If Planescape Torment ever had a true spiritual successor, it was the criminally underappreciated expansion for Neverwinter Nights 2, Mask of the Betrayer. However, the adventure relies quite heavily on Forgotten Realms lore without explaining everything like Torment did. The original campaign did little to prepare the players for the expansion as well, so I'm going to talk about the things I wish I'd known when I first played the game some 16 years ago. Let's start at the very beginning, which is MYRKUL'S ascension to godhood. After all, it was him who created the conditions and circumstances that later on sparked the events of the adventure. Before he became a god, he was a powerful adventuring necromancer, among other things, whose ambition was to achieve divinity. To this end, he forged an alliance with the mortal Bane and Bhaal, the latter of whom is certainly familiar to you if you played Baldur's Gate. The trio became to be known as the Dark Three, and they sought to usurp the power of Jergal, the Lord of End of Everything. Jergal was an ancient greater deity of immense power, whose portfolio included strife, death, and the dead. History of the Dead 3, an in-game book we can read in Baldur's Gate, provides a great description. Jergal fomented and fed on the discord among mortals and powers alike. When beings slew each other in their quest for power or in their hatred, he welcomed them in his shadowy kingdom of eternal gloom. As all things died, everything came to him eventually, and over time he built his power into a kingdom unchallenged by any god. It is no wonder that mortals as power-hungry and as evil as Bane, Bhaal, and MYRKUL wanted this sort of power for themselves. However, as vain as they were not stupid. The Dark Three recognized that challenging a greater deity in his own domain requires lots of knowledge and power in itself. At the peak of their epic mortal adventures, they led a coalition against a mighty entity called Maram of the Great Spear, which was considered one of the 7 lost gods and one of the elder evils. The power of such beings rivaled or sometimes even surpassed that of demigods. That might not mean much in the realm of the gods, but in the world of mortals, it could mean unimaginable levels of destruction. As you might guess, the loss of life in the battle was enormous. Barely anyone made it back home, in fact, but I doubt the 3 leaders cared. The actual goal of the Dark Three in leading the coalition was most likely to extract the Divine Spark from Maram. A divine spark, according to Ed Greenwood, one of the creators of the Forgotten Realms setting, is, quote, an ineffable essence of divinity, that special something that deities have and mortals lack. Having absorbed it from the said primordial, the trio empowered themselves significantly. Once they considered themselves ready, they traveled to the grey waste of Hades, the midpoint of the lower planes, or a neutral evil plane, if you will. There, the castle of Bone, Jergal's home, was located. On their way to his throne, they destroyed legions of undead, including liches, arguably the most powerful form of undead. But surely they were not prepared for what happened when they finally confronted the Lord of End of Everything. The trio was not aware that Jergal was in fact bored of his eons-long reign and incredible might. As History of the Dead 3 describes it, without challenge there is nothing, and in nothingness there is only gloom. In such a state, the difference between absolute power and absolute powerlessness is undetectable. So when they challenged him, he indifferently said, "The throne is yours. I have grown weary of this empty power. Take it if you wish. I promise to serve and guide you as your seneschal until you grow comfortable with the position. Who among you shall rule?" Unsurprisingly, this is where the alliance of Bane, Bhaal, and MYRKUL came to an inevitable end. A fierce battle erupted, but none of the 3 was able to come out victorious. The Lord of End of Everything, clearly bored, then said, "After all you have sacrificed, would you come away with nothing? Why don't you divide the portfolios of the office and engage in a game of skill for them? If you think this is where weird things stopped happening, you're dead wrong. Unless the author of the book wrote it on drugs, the trio played skull bowling. They literally bowled the skulls of Jergal's most powerful liches. The game was indecisive, however, because Malar, the god of the beasts, happened to come to visit Jergal, and seeing what was happening, he chased the skulls to sabotage the game, as he also wanted to compete for the power that was being divided. So the Dark Three started fighting again until Jergal proposed a game of luck rather than skill. Therefore, they played a game of knucklebones with Jergal's finger bones. Imagine destroying a demigod and an army of undead just to play skull bowling and knucklebones to decide who becomes an evil god of what. In any event, Bane won and said, "As a winner, I choose to rule for all eternity as the ultimate tyrant. I can induce hatred and strife at my whim, and all will bow down before me while in my kingdom." MYRKUL, who had won second place, declared, "But I choose dead, and by doing so I truly win, because all you are lord over, Bane, will eventually be mine. All things must die, even gods." Bhaal, who finished third, demurred, "I choose death, and it is by my hand that all that you rule, Lord Bane, will eventually pass to Lord MYRKUL. Both of you must pay honor to me and obey my wishes, since I can destroy your kingdom, Bane, by murdering your subjects, and I can starve your kingdom, MYRKUL, by staying my hand." As for Malar, when he finally collected the skulls and went all the way back to Jergal's throne, he realized that he was late to the party. And Jergal merely smiled, for he had been delivered. Or actually, he became an eternal accountant in the realm of the dead. That was one quite unlikely tale of ascension to godhood, but MYRKUL was equally interesting as the god of the dead. Unfortunately, his backstory was not explored as well as it could have been in Mask of the Betrayer, but in the game's defense, it was probably one of the sacrifices made at the altar of story pacing. Anyway, the Lord of Bones had a clever worship model, gaining influence by making mortals terrified of him. He was not popular in the traditional sense. Very few people chose MYRKUL as their patron deity, but everyone in their right mind feared and respected him. Unsurprisingly, he devised ways to spread the fear of death among the mortals, and thus he always stayed in the back of their heads. He was even known to occasionally appear during funerals, scythe in hand, stare at those gathered for a few silent moments and then disappear. For those who chose him as their patron deity, MYRKUL had a simple yet powerful dogma to abide by. "Know me and fear me. My embrace is for all, and is patient but sure. The dead can always find you. My hand is everywhere. There is no door I cannot pass, nor guardian who can withstand me." His clergy, although not numerous, definitely played a role in making mortals fear death and MYRKUL, as was expected of them. The priests tended to be loners and took great care to conceal their identities, always leaving behind the place where they were born and raised. They often enjoyed the fear they struck into others, which often stemmed from the rumor that to touch or act against a priest of MYRKUL brings death. The best part is, they were the source of it, and then were expected to spread it further. MYRKUL liked to be unpredictable, so sometimes he liked to play being almost kind and caring. Similarly, his priests were expected to tend to the dying and make them as comfortable as possible in their last moments. They also dealt in funerals, disposing of plague victims, or even carrying out last wishes and such, all for a fee, of course. The Lord of Bones tested his faithful as well. When a plague called Black Whisper struck Mulsantir, a large city in Rashomon that we visit in Mask of the Betrayer, only 2 of his priests tended to the dying, while the rest of the clergy cowered in the temple. MYRKUL took notice, and while the 2 remained in good health, the Lord of Bones allowed the plague to spread into the temple and kill everyone who hid within its walls. Finally, MYRKUL'S greatest inventions as the god of the dead were the concepts of the Faithless and the False. In time, they went on to play a crucial role in the compact between mortals and gods. According to Forgotten Realms campaign setting 3rd edition, and I quote, "The Faithless firmly denied any faith or only gave lip service to the gods for most of their lives without truly believing. The False intentionally betrayed a faith they believed in and to which they had made a personal commitment." Now, the thing to keep in mind is that the existence of gods in the Forgotten Realms was a fact, so it had nothing to do with belief in the traditional sense. Most Varunians were polytheistic, although some had one patron deity, for example connected to their livelihood, but also worshipped other gods depending on the circumstances. It could be to gain their favor or in hopes to protect themselves from their evil whims. In any case, atheism as we understand it was pretty much like wearing a tinfoil hat in the realms. It would be more likely to find non-worshippers, as in those who for some reason thought that the gods were assholes that did not deserve to be worshipped, for example. And while there is definitely something to it, the truth of the statement doesn't change the facts of life. So, what happened to those who did not believe or neglected the worship of the gods? Well, those judged the Faithless were sent to the Wall of the Faithless, another contribution of MYRKUL to the planes. It was a huge structure that surrounded the City of Judgment, where the present god of the dead resided and ruled over his domain. The wall was literally built of tormented souls, those already consumed entirely and those still being devoured by its insatiable hunger. These bricks, let's call them, were covered by a supernatural green mold that held them in place and slowly swallowed their twisted bodies and faces. Every shift in the wall was accompanied by a symphony of shattering limbs, cracking bones, and agonized cries of pain and pleas for mercy. However, the structure was merciless in serving its purpose. The horribly convulsed faces were disappearing one by one as they were drawn further back and dissolved into the substance of the wall, and then new, unfortunate souls would take their place on the outside layer. The City of Judgment, a book we can find in the opening dungeon of Mask of the Betrayer, mentions how some souls cling to the hope of salvation, of rescue at the hands of the eponymous betrayer. It recounts the desperate and the hopeful cries of the Faithless. "Cursed are we," they cried, "who denied the jealous gods, and now we are forsaken." And the other voices answered them, saying, "Remember the betrayer's crusade. Remember the betrayer who swore to bring down the wall. Have patience, for the betrayer may yet return." Unfortunately for those tormented souls, the wall was not the only suffering that could befall them. Demons would raid the wall periodically, tearing the helpless souls from its grasp to drag them into the abyss, to turn them into the lowest, mindless form of their kind, cannon fodder to be used in the Blood War, the eternal conflict in the lower planes. As for those judged the False, their fate depended on how they lived their lives and the seriousness of their offenses. While all of them stayed within the City of Judgment, their lot within its walls could vary from, for example, being conscripted into the militia to, if they screwed up big time, eternal torture at the hands or talons of devils. There was no way to bail them out easily either. The only way to resurrect the False is through incredibly powerful spells such as Wish or Miracle, which effectively means divine intervention, probably with no guarantee of success. So obviously it was out of the question for the vast majority of mortals. Of course, there were some exceptions. For example, if one was very much devoted to a given idea in life, some god might want to take them under their wings, even though they never intentionally worshipped them. Those who did not have one patron deity were usually taken by the one they worshipped the most. Generally speaking, the gods were not too picky, and to harvest as many souls as possible for themselves was to their advantage. Although there were instances of souls who were rejected by their deities but were not judged false or faithless either, all that was left for them to do was to roam the fugue plane, which I think could be a punishment of its own, all dressed up and nowhere to go. But what of the faithful? What was their reward for their devotion? Well, this depended on who they were devoted to. There is no unified heaven and hell as we understand it in the Forgotten Realms. Before a soul of a deceased mortal left the fugue plane, they were known as petitioners, as they petitioned the gods to take them to their domain, in a manner of speaking. Eventually, usually within a 10-day, an agent of their patron deity, or the one they simply worshipped the most, would come for them. What happened next depended entirely on which realm they ended up in. However, there was an alternative, which could have been tempting for those who served particularly vile powers or were guilty of some terrible crimes, and knew their eternal life might not exactly be a pleasure cruise. KELEMVOR, who was a recently appointed god of the dead during the events of Mask of the Betrayer, made a deal with the Beatezu, the devils of the Nine Hells, allowing them to make pacts with the awaiting petitioners. And there was a long queue before the supplicant's gate. The City of the Dead, the book I quoted earlier, describes it like this: a city grey and forbidding beneath an empty sky. Before its gates came a hideous procession, all the dead of the world, of 100 worlds, awaiting the judgments of the gods. The devils were forbidden from harming or deceiving the mortals in any way, so their success rate was still pretty low. Their ultimate goal was to create more of their kind. Obviously, nobody was interested in becoming cannon fodder in the Blood War, unless the alternative was worse. Souls as such were also the currency of the planes, quite literally sometimes. The so-called soul coins were minted in the Nine Hells, each of them hosting a tormented soul within. Those who would decide to strike a deal with the Beatezu usually were more powerful souls, and so they were in a better position to negotiate. They could ask for different boons, such as an early promotion to a more powerful form of a devil, or for certain services to be performed in the prime material plane. One could wish to grant great riches to their living relatives, for instance, or to exact a horrifying fiendish revenge on their enemies. As far as mortal souls were concerned, the Infernal Pacts were no joke, because they took precedence over the gods. For example, Amon-Jero, one of the antagonists and then companions in the original campaign, signed such a pact, and therefore he could give the gods and the Wall of the Faithless the middle finger. The caveat was that his soul was bound to the Nine Hells and he would suffer there for eternity, but hey, it's not like we read end-user agreements before installing games. In all seriousness though, Amon-Jero was in fact way more powerful than the game mechanics let on. But the original campaign and its cut content is a topic for another video. In any event, one of my favorite things about the Beatezu is the fact that they are a twisted embodiment of the lawful evil alignment. Sure, they like to play tricks such as loopholes and weird interpretations of contracts, but they do, by their own nature, respect the law. So, if a mortal felt they were cheated in some way, they could make an appeal before their soul was taken to hell. Better yet, they could even count on legal counsel and an attorney, so it was possible to make an illegitimate pact null and void. But then again, the devils surely enjoyed mortal vanity and overconfidence, and they had the experience advantage measured in centuries. What about the mortals? Could they become immortal in any other way than the very unlikely ascension to godhood? There were ways to do that. None of them easily available, of course, and certainly not to every peasant out there. But a powerful enough individual could probably give time, the gods and the devils the slip. At least for a while, as they can all be very patient. Now, first we have to differentiate between agelessness and immortality, as these are quite different concepts. To be ageless means to have a body that doesn't suffer or very slowly suffers from the effects of aging, allowing one to theoretically live or exist for a very long time. But it doesn't mean an ageless person cannot be killed in a variety of ways. In Mask of the Betrayer, there are two interesting cases of characters who are ageless, but clearly achieved that through different means and with different results. Immortality, in turn, doesn't necessarily mean immunity to death. Rather, it means that such a being is ageless, and then it takes not only immense power but also meeting certain conditions to kill it, like say, slaying it in its home plane. Gods have been killed by powerful mortals, though not without considerable help or very advantageous circumstances, or both. MYRKUL is actually such a case, and we'll get to that in a second. In any case, it's no accident that KELEMVOR mentions evading death in his dogma. Aside from the most obvious stuff like the raise dead and resurrection spells, and vile stuff like becoming a lich, one could use the clone spell to create a perfect copy of themselves. When their original self dies, their soul immediately seeks out the clone. It's theoretically possible to do it indefinitely, and therefore elude KELEMVOR'S judgment or the consequences of an infernal contract. Another interesting option is to live in the astral plane. Time flows there normally, but the effects of its flow do not. I think it could be compared to very extreme time dilation in relation to the prime material plane. Of course, there are more possibilities, and I probably know a half of them, or less anyway. So let's change the subject and talk about the end of MYRKUL'S reign as the god of the dead. MYRKUL'S death was indirectly his own doing. You see, he conspired with Bane to steal the Tablets of Fate from Ao, the Overgod who ruled over all deities. The Tablets of Fate served a few purposes, such as balancing the forces of law and chaos, and recording the name and purpose of every god. Their hope was to weaken him, since they mistakenly assumed that Ao's power heavily relied on these artifacts. Upon discovering that the tablets are missing, Ao summoned all gods and demanded their return. Of course, MYRKUL and Bane kept their secret and the stolen artifacts, so the Overgod decided to banish all gods to Faerun to roam their land as avatars of their godly selves until the tablets were recovered. The only god who remained in power was Helm, tasked with guarding the so-called celestial stairway that linked the prime material plane with the other planes, including the home planes of the banished deities. And so, all the powers, guilty and innocent alike, were trapped in the realm of their faithful, the gates to heaven closed before them and watched by the patron of all guardians. The result of Ao's decision were catastrophic for the mortals, and the events that unfolded afterwards were most commonly called the Time of Troubles. The divine magic, which is the one accessed by clerics, stopped working altogether unless the caster was within 1 mile from his god's avatar. The arcane magic, in turn, became incredibly unpredictable and dangerous, as Mystra, the goddess of magic, did not oversee it anymore. On top of that, Mystra was killed by Helm when she tried to force her way into the heavens to speak with Ao. If this wasn't bad enough for the mortals, they had ridiculously powerful and probably pissed off avatars roaming the realms. What could possibly go wrong? However, Ao was not acting out of spite, or at least not entirely. He saw that the gods were more interested in furthering their own goals rather than serving their purpose. Their banishment was a form of punishment, but the Overgod also wanted to force the exiled deities to pay attention to their worshippers. When the Tablets of Fate were returned to the Overgod, thanks to the efforts of several powerful mortals, he allowed the gods back in the heavens, but the things would never be the same again. Those powerful adventurers included the mortal Cyric, KELEMVOR, and Midnight, a young mage who would later reincarnate as the new Mystra. To keep the long story short, the Dark Three I mentioned earlier became known as the Dead Three. MYRKUL was killed in Waterdeep while fighting Midnight, a young female mage who possessed some power over the dead Mystra. MYRKUL got distracted by a swooping griffin. Midnight took advantage of this opportunity and managed to hit MYRKUL with a spell called Disintegrate, killing his avatar on the spot. Well, to quote the greatest words of wisdom uttered by one Alistair from Dragon Age, swooping is bad. There were many changes in the Faerunian pantheon, but I'm going to focus on the gods of the dead. MYRKUL was replaced by Cyric, who ascended to godhood and remained in this position for a decade. For a while, he actually wielded all the portfolios of the Dead 3, making him one of the most powerful gods. In fact, he had what Jergal had back in his full glory. 10 years after the time of troubles, the Prince of Lies was killed by KELEMVOR, who then ascended to godhood and became the new god of the dead. His reign quickly proved to be very different from his predecessors. The new Lord of the Dead worked really hard to change the way the mortals viewed death, not as an evil to be feared and evaded, but merely a part of life. What's interesting, the transition of the clergy of the subsequent gods of the dead were incredibly smooth. New boss, new rules, just change the holy symbol, repaint the walls, and it's business as usual. However, the changeover was not as seamless in terms of the divine affairs. Initially, KELEMVOR tended to judge the dead as a fellow mortal rather than a deity. He judged the honorable and the brave with clemency, while the cowards and the crafty were punished severely. This situation had two major consequences. First, the mortals who enjoyed the favor of the Lord of the Dead were not afraid of death anymore, and would go as far as to throw their life away, knowing that good things awaited them in the afterlife. Conversely, the others were terrified of dying, causing some deities to lose potential worshippers. At the same time, Mystra, the one reincarnated from the Mage Midnight, clearly favored good mortals in granting magic. The major problem it caused, however, was the violation of the so-called cosmic balance. The cosmic balance was a concept dictating that the forces of good and evil, and law and chaos, need to be balanced, as they cannot exist without each other. The true neutral alignment could be considered an example of the balance. Evil and chaos have their place in the multiverse, they aren't a thing that has to be eradicated. The Blood War was in fact a war between two evils, a chaotic and a lawful one. Because neither side could achieve victory, you could say that it was an example of the balance applied to the lower planes. Should either the devils or the demons emerge victorious, they could pose a great threat to all the other planes. Both KELEMVOR and Mystra had to abandon their mortal sentiments. The change in the City of Judgment was radical. The entire place became grey and grim. Those who were already judged had their sentences re-evaluated, which was kind of a chaotic and unfair act if you ask me, but never mind. The Lord of the Dead became cold but fair judge. He even rid himself of the signs of his former mortality and started wearing a mask to appear almost featureless. And actually, KELEMVOR had been holding his office for just 6 years when the events of Neverwinter Nights 2 and its expansion packs took place. So we could witness his very early years when MYRKUL was still a very fresh memory. A memory that probably still terrified many. Things changed drastically when the time of troubles ended. By Eo's decree, the power of gods, or even their survival, became largely dependent on the number and faith of their worshippers, thus forcing the restored or newly appointed deities to attend to their duties and be responsive to their faithful. With the Wall of the Faithless and laws regarding the false already in place, the mortals were also kept in check and had a compelling reason to sustain gods with their worship. Thus, the compact between the gods and the mortals was cemented. Now, when I first played Mask of the Betrayer when it came out in 2007, I thought the Wall of the Faithless was a great injustice. To be honest, I still think so, but having grown a bit older, I also see the bigger picture. Perhaps one of the most insightful things said by MYRKUL is that justice does not drive the planes. In fact, the wall's existence alone can make one doubt whether any god is truly good or lawful if they don't oppose it. But before I finish this train of thought, I'd like to re-emphasize the quite ingenious way that MYRKUL secured his continued existence, even in death. Even when he was no longer the god of the dead, and KELEMVOR worked hard to change the mortal view of death, the fear of the Wall of the Faithless sustained him, and so did the Spirit Eater curse and the havoc it wreaked.